Hey guys, tonight we step back in time, way back to the clamoring, vibrant, frankly, rather smelly heart of a medieval city. Close your eyes for a second and picture it. Towering walls loom before you, carved stone and weathered wood. The air thick with 1,000 different scents. Wood smoke, baking bread, damp earth, livestock, and, yeah, let's be honest, quite a bit of human and animal waste. Ahead, the massive gate groans open, spilling forth a torrent of humanity. Merchants, beggars, priests, soldiers, farmers, all pushing and jostling a chaotic river, flowing into an even more chaotic sea within the walls. You clutch your meager purse a little tighter, pulling your cloak closer, because beneath the surface of this bustling metropolis lies another world entirely. A world of shadow secrets and survival by any means necessary. A world where you probably won't survive this encounter for very long without a serious dose of luck and street smarts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you shuffle through the fortified gate, joining the slow, shuffling stream of people entering the city, the sheer scale of the place hits you. This isn't the quiet village you might be used to. This is a beast, a sprawling, breathing entity of stone and timber and flesh. The noise is deafening. The rattle of carts over cobblestones, the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, the bleating of sheep being driven to market, the distant ringing of church bells, the low hum of 1,000 conversations in 12 different dialects. Your eyes dart around, trying to take it all in. Buildings seem to lean precariously into the narrow streets, the upper stories often jettied out over the ground floor, almost meeting overhead, creating a perpetual twilight below. You smell sweat and stale beer from a nearby tavern, the pungent aroma of tanning hides from down a side alley, the sweetness of roasting meat from a cook shop, all layered with that pervasive underlying scent of, well, the city just living. It's overwhelming, a sensory assault, unlike anything you've ever experienced. You expected crowds, sure, but this is something else. You're pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, merchants with their heavily laden mules, priests in their somber robes, ragged figures whose eyes seem to follow your every move, and burly porters hefting impossible loads. You try to keep your belongings close, acutely aware that a lapse in attention could cost you dearly. The feeling is immediate trust is a luxury you can't afford here. Everyone seems to be looking out for themselves, and opportunity or desperation flickers in many eyes. This isn't just a place of commerce and prayer. It's a hunting ground for those who live outside the strictures of formal society, those who prey on the unsuspecting. The architecture itself feels slightly menacing. The jetted upper stories, while offering more floor space above, also create perfect hiding places. Deep shadows where someone could melt away or lie in wait. You notice narrow passages branching off the main thoroughfare, dark gaps between buildings that seem to lead into a labyrinth of unknowns. These are the arteries of the city's less respectable life shortcuts, for those who know them, potential traps for those who don't. You glimpse figures disappearing into them, perhaps a servant on an errand, or perhaps someone with less savory intentions. Walking deeper into the city, the main street opens up into a wider square, the marketplace. Here, the chaos intensifies. Stalls overflow with goods. Cloth spices, pottery livestock, fresh produce. The din is incredible, a symphony of haggling, shouting, and animal sounds. You watch a merchant loudly proclaiming the quality of his fabric, while nearby, a toothless old woman eyes passers-by with a calculating stare, her hand subtly extended. This is where the first layer of the city's underworld reveals itself. The petty criminals, the opportunists who live on the edges of legitimate trade. You keep your hand firmly on your coin purse, a target painted on you the moment you walked through the gate looking like a newcomer. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval cities, despite their defensive walls and communal organizations, struggled immensely with basic public order, making them ripe environments for petty crime simply due to the sheer density of people and goods. Pickpockets, cut purses, and confidence tricksters thrived in these crowded environments, preying on the distracted or the naive. It's like the ultimate game of urban survival mode, where losing track of your surroundings for a second means potentially losing everything. One quirky tidbit you might notice is the presence of criers, or proclaimers, scattered throughout the market and key intersections. These aren't just official town criers. Some are essentially paid gossips or advertisers shouting out news advertisements or even searching for lost items or people. While seemingly legitimate, their presence highlights how easily information could be controlled or manipulated in the city, and how easy it was for individuals, even seemingly respectable ones, to operate in a gray area between legitimate business and something less clear-cut. They might be announcing a ship's arrival one minute and discreetly pointing out a wealthy-looking target to an associate the next. Historians still argue whether the level of petty crime in medieval cities was a constant low hum, or if it surged significantly during specific periods like market days or festivals, making it hard to pin down just how dangerous your average stroll through the marketplace truly was. It certainly feels dangerous right now. As you move further away from the main market square, the streets narrow again. The smells change, becoming less about commerce and more about dwelling. You pass open doorways where families are crammed together, the sounds of their lives spilling out onto the street. You see children playing in the gutters. Playing in the gutters, you grimace, and notice the ubiquitous presence of dogs, some scavenging, some guarding none, looking particularly friendly. The layers of the city's underbelly are becoming more apparent. The street performers, the beggars, the figures lurking in doorways. They are part of the fabric of this place, living alongside the merchants and artisans, but operating by a different set of rules, a different code of survival. You've only just arrived, and already you can feel the shift, the sense that beneath the surface of bustling commerce, a darker, more desperate world is waiting to reveal itself. You navigate through the throngs, the pressure of bodies, a constant reminder of how easy it would be to disappear, or for something of yours to disappear from you. This is the prime hunting ground for the lowest rung of the urban criminal ladder, the pickpockets and the con artists. They aren't usually violent, at least not unless cornered, but they are masters of distraction and opportunity. They operate in the thickest crowds, the market square, the entrances to churches during services, anywhere people gather, and are focused on something other than the safety of their coin. You might see a commotion erupt just ahead. A minor argument, a dropped load of goods, a sudden loud cry. Your attention, like everyone else's, is drawn to the scene, and that, my friend, is exactly the moment it happens. While your eyes are fixed on the manufactured drama, a hand quick and practiced reaches for your belt pouch. These aren't just pickpockets, as we might think of them. The most common term was cut purse. Your purse, a simple leather bag, tied or sewn onto your belt, is vulnerable. The cut purse uses a razor, a sharp knife, or even specially hardened fingernails to snip the ties or cut the fabric itself. A swift motion, and your entire liquid wealth, a few silver pennies, maybe a groat if you're lucky, is gone, falling into a waiting hand or a hidden pocket within seconds. You won't feel it happen in the crush. By the time you realize your purse is lighter, the culprit is already yards away, blending back into the anonymous sea of faces. It's estimated, though, medieval records are spotty that pickpocketing and cut-pursing were among the most frequent crimes in any sizable city. It was a low-risk, high-reward activity for the perpetrator, at least if they were good at it, and a potentially devastating loss for the victim, who might have been carrying a week's wages or more. Imagine losing your wallet today, but in an era with no banks, no cards, no way to cancel anything. That's the medieval equivalent. Losing your purse could mean no food for your family, no rent money, a spiral into destitution. A grim thought to have while admiring a juggler or listening to a traveling musician, isn't it? Beyond the swift, silent theft, there are the cons. These are less about brute force and more about exploiting trust or greed. You might be approached by someone with a sob story, a sudden illness and the family goods stolen, needing just a small amount to get home. Or someone might offer you a deal that sounds too good to be true. A piece of genuine silk at a ridiculously low price, a supposedly valuable artifact they found. Remember, you don't have quick ways to verify stories or appraise goods. Your judgment is your only defense, and these con artists are experts at reading people, spotting the hopeful, the naive, the trusting mark. One classic con involved fake relics or charms. Someone might try to sell you a bone shard, supposedly from a saint, or a magical amulet guaranteed to ward off illness or bring good fortune. The faithful desperate for divine intervention or protection in a harsh world were easy targets. You hand over a coin for a worthless scrap, the seller pockets the money, and you're left with a piece of bone that might well have belonged to a chicken. A truly quirky tidbit is the documented existence of pardoner scams, individuals selling official-looking, or sometimes genuinely official but abused indulgences or pardons for sins, essentially selling forgiveness. Chaucer wrote about a particularly greasy example in the Canterbury Tales, highlighting how widespread and resented this particular brand of spiritual con artistry could be. Another common trick involved shortchanging or using weighted scales. In the bustling market, with multiple transactions happening simultaneously, it was easy for a vendor to quickly swap a lighter weight for a heavier one, or palm a coin while counting change. You're focused on the goods. The price, the sheer volume of people, and the vendor is an expert at sleight of hand. You walk away, thinking you got a fair deal, only realizing later, if at all, that you were cheated out of a few pennies. It adds up for them, a steady, low-level income stream pulled from hundreds of small deceptions every market day. While laws against theft and fraud did exist, their enforcement in the chaotic urban environment was challenging. The city watch, whom we'll meet shortly, were often few in number and spread thin. Catching a cut purse in the act was difficult, and proving fraud was even harder without clear evidence. Many victims likely never reported these minor crimes, assuming their loss was simply the cost of doing business or navigating the city. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of petty crime was simply a symptom of poverty and desperation, or if it represented a more organized, albeit low-level criminal subculture with its own networks and territories within the city walls. Was it just individual opportunists, or were there figures orchestrating things, taking cuts? The truth is likely a messy mix of both. But for you navigating these streets, the distinction doesn't matter much. All that matters is keeping your hand on your purse and your wits about you. Because around every corner, in every crowd, someone is looking for an easy mark. As the sun dips below the city walls, casting long, distorted shadows down the narrow streets, the atmosphere in the medieval city undergoes a palpable transformation. The frantic energy of the day begins to drain away, replaced by a different kind of tension. Shops close their shutters, bolts are drawn on doors, and the cheerful clamor of the marketplace gives way to a more muted, cautious sounds and silence. Oh, the silence can be loud after dark in a place like this. There are no streetlights in the modern sense, save for the occasional flickering lantern hung outside a wealthy merchant's house or a late-night tavern. The moonlight, if there is any, struggles to penetrate the canopy of jetted buildings overhead. The streets become pools of inky blackness, broken only by faint slivers of light from shuttered windows. This is when the city's underbelly truly stirs. The opportunism of the day, the quick snip of a purse string, or the whispered con gives way to something bolder, more direct. The darkness is a cloak, offering anonymity and concealment to those with ill intent. Petty theft escalates into burglary and robbery crimes that carry far greater risks, but also promise potentially larger rewards. Imagine you've found lodgings for the night, perhaps in a busy inn or a quieter guest house down a side street. You bolt your door, maybe pile a heavy chest against it for good measure. But medieval construction isn't exactly Fort Knox. Homes and shops, even those of the relatively wealthy, were often built primarily of timber and plaster, with doors secured by simple wooden bars or basic metal locks. Windows might be covered with shutters, but glass was a luxury, and many simply had oiled cloth or animal horn, easily cut or punched through. This vulnerability made them prime targets for burglary. Burglars or housebreakers would wait until dark, when the occupants were asleep or absent. They might use simple tools, a pry bar, a drill. Yes, drills existed, though not the power tools we know, or even just brute force, to jimmy open shutters, force doors, or even tunnel through thin walls. Their goal: to get and grab valuables, coin, silver plate, expensive cloth tools, and get out as quickly and quietly as possible. The risks were high. If discovered, the homeowner or neighbors might raise the hue and cry, and getting caught inside someone's home after dark was often seen as proof of criminal intent, leading to severe punishment. But the potential payout, the accumulated wealth of a merchant or artisan, could be worth the gamble. Then there's robbery, the crime that often inspires the most fear. This happens out on the streets, under the cover of darkness. If you are foolish or unfortunate enough to be out late, perhaps returning from a tavern, or trying to reach your lodgings after the gate closes, you become a potential victim. You might be ambushed in a dark alley, or simply confronted on a quiet street. Robbers, unlike the stealthy cut purses, use intimidation or violence. They might demand your money and belongings at knife point, or simply assault you and take what you have. There's no guarantee of your safety, even if you comply. resistance could lead to serious injury or worse. Medieval streets at night were genuinely dangerous places, and a mainstream historical fact is that cities often impose strict curfews requiring citizens to be indoors after dark, precisely to mitigate the risks of crime and allow the limited night watch to function more effectively. Violating curfew could get you arrested simply for being out and about. You might chuckle at the idea of medieval lock-picking, but it was a skill some criminals certainly possessed. A quirky tidbit is that early forms of skeleton keys, or picks, were developed allowing access to simpler locks. Records sometimes mention thieves being caught with instruments of housebreaking, which could range from basic tools to specialized items designed to bypass common locking mechanisms. It wasn't exactly Bond-level gadgetry, but effective enough against the technology of the time. Imagine a thief painstakingly filing down a piece of metal for hours just to jimmy open a wooden chest. Dedication, medieval style. The fear of robbery wasn't just about losing your property. It was the threat of violence that truly terrified people. Being attacked in the dark alone with little hope of immediate help. It's a primal fear that transcends the centuries. While we have records of both burglary and robbery, historians still argue whether violent street robbery was a constant pervasive threat throughout the medieval period, or if it was more common in certain periods of unrest or economic hardship. Were you truly likely to be mugged just stepping outside after sunset? Or was the fear often greater than the reality for the average citizen? It's difficult to say definitively, as crime records often reflect who was caught, rather than every crime committed. But the warnings were clear. Stay indoors, bar your doors, and if you must venture out, do so in a group and carry a lantern. Because once the sun sets, the city belongs to the shadows, and the line between the law-abiding citizen and the criminal predator becomes very, very thin. But the city isn't just dangerous because of calculated crime, the kind where someone intends to rob you or break into your home. It's also dangerous because people lived cheek by jowl in a high-stress environment, and tempers could flare with astonishing speed. Violence erupts often seemingly out of nowhere, turning a busy street or a boisterous tavern into a scene of sudden messy conflict. You don't need to be a wealthy merchant or carry a full purse to become a target of this kind of spontaneous aggression. Sometimes, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time or saying the wrong thing to the wrong person is enough. The most common flashpoints. Taverns, absolutely. Imagine cramped, smoky rooms filled with people drinking ale or mead, loud conversations echoing off low ceilings, maybe a musician playing raucously in the corner. Alcohol lowers inhibitions, fuels grievances, and mixes poorly with medieval notions of honor and easily bruised egos. An argument over a game of dice, a perceived insult, a dispute about politics or religion, even just someone bumping into another person a bit too hard. It could all escalate rapidly. Voices rise, fists clench, and suddenly a table is overturned and bodies are grappling on the floor. These aren't usually planned fights. They're messy, impulsive brawls. People grab whatever is at hand. Tankards, stools, bottles, maybe a knife they happen to be carrying for eating or work. The goal isn't necessarily to kill, but to injure, to dominate, to win the immediate petty conflict. You might see someone get a broken nose from a punch, a deep gash from a dropped piece of pottery, or a serious wound from a knife thrust in the heat of the moment. The fight is often over as quickly as it began, leaving behind overturned furniture, spilled drinks, and injured, often remorseful participants. But brawls weren't confined to taverns. They could happen anywhere. A dispute between two vendors in the market over territory, an argument between apprentices from rival guilds, a disagreement over a debt collector's trying to collect from a poor craftsman. The sparks were everywhere. Life was hard, resources were often scarce, and social interactions could be brutally direct. People didn't always have the same filters or outlets for frustration that we might take for granted today. Consider the sheer physical proximity. You are constantly in contact with strangers. Personal space is a foreign concept. You're jostled, shoved, stepped on. In this environment, a simple accident could easily be perceived as an intentional slight, leading to an angry confrontation. Add to that the lack of effective, immediate policing. The city watch, as we've hinted, wasn't exactly a rapid response unit, and individuals often felt the need to defend their own honor or interest directly with force if necessary. It was a society where displaying weakness could make you a target, and being willing to defend yourself, even violently, was often seen as a necessary part of urban survival. A mainstream historical fact is that court records from medieval cities are absolutely full of cases related to assault, battery, and brawling. They far outnumber cases of murder. These weren't necessarily felony crimes, unless they resulted in death or severe permanent injury, but they were common disruptions to the peace. The records detail everything from simple punches thrown to more serious attacks with weapons. It paints a picture of daily life punctuated by frequent low-level violence. It's like living in a video game where random NPC interactions could suddenly turn hostile if you accidentally bump into someone or say something they don't like. Game over, you owe them a new nose. Sometimes the reasons for the fights recorded in court are almost bizarrely mundane or specific, providing a quirky tidbit into medieval sensibilities. There are cases of men fighting over who had the right to walk on a particular side of the street, or neighbors brawling over chicken trespassing into their yard, or even disputes over which craftsman did better work escalating into a physical altercation. It really highlights how quickly small issues could become big, painful ones. This prevalence of interpersonal violence leads to an open scholarly debate whether people in the medieval period were inherently more prone to aggression due to different social norms and tolerances for violence, or if the harsh living conditions, close quarters, and lack of effective state control over minor disputes simply meant that everyday frustrations boiled over into physical altercations more readily than they might in a modern city. Was it nature or nurture and environment? It's hard to say definitively. But standing here, hearing the distant shouts that might just be revelry, but could easily be something darker, you get the distinct feeling that keeping your head down and avoiding confrontation is probably the safest bet. Because in this city, a bad mood and a sharp object are a common and dangerous combination. While those common brawls we just talked about usually ended with bruises, broken bones, or perhaps a lost earlobe, if things got really out of hand sometimes. Tragically, they went much, much further. That sudden burst of anger, that desperate lunge with a sharp object, could have fatal consequences. Murder, while less frequent than simple assault, was a grim reality in the medieval city, and it was treated with extreme seriousness by the law. It was the crime that ripped the social fabric, most violently striking fear into the hearts of citizens in a way even robbery couldn't quite match. Unlike the premeditated, calculating murders you might see in modern crime dramas, medieval murder in cities was often impulsive, a crime of passion or opportunity rather than careful planning. Think of that tavern brawl escalating. A knife pulled in drunken fury, a heavy stool brought down too hard, or an argument between neighbors over property lines or livestock turning deadly in a fit of rage. Jealousy, betrayal, long-standing feuds simmering beneath the surface. These personal conflicts frequently boiled over, sometimes with fatal results. The close quarters, the high emotions, the easy access to potential weapons everyone carried. Knife tools were everywhere. It all contributed to an environment where disputes could, and sometimes did, turn deadly in an instant. You might walk past an alleyway one morning and see a crowd gathered, hear hushed whispers. Someone was found dead. Was it a robbery gone wrong? The victim resisting and paying the ultimate price? Was it a settling of scores between rivals? Or was it something more mundane, a private disagreement that exploded in the darkness? The ambiguity itself was terrifying. The lack of sophisticated forensic techniques meant that uncovering the truth could be incredibly difficult, leaving room for suspicion and fear to fester. While some murders were linked to other crimes, like a merchant killed during a burglary, many were domestic disputes, arguments between acquaintances, or the tragic outcome of a drunken fight. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval law codes often made a clear distinction between premeditated murder, homicide, and killing in the heat of the moment, or self-defense, often categorized as manslaughter or even justifiable homicide depending on the circumstances. However, proving intent was difficult, and even killings that seemed accidental in a brawl could be prosecuted harshly if the authorities decided to make an example. The legal nuances were complex and varied depending on the city and the time period, but taking a life, regardless of how it happened, was a monumental event in the eyes of the community and the law. Finding the perpetrator could be a challenge. If the killing happened in a crowded area, someone might have seen something, but fear of reprisal could keep witnesses silent. If it happened in a secluded spot, like a dark alley or inside a home, the trail might go cold quickly. There was no citywide police force collecting evidence and interviewing suspects systematically in the way we understand it. Justice often relied on someone raising the hue and cry immediately after the crime, rallying neighbors to pursue the culprit, or on the victim's family pursuing the case in court themselves. A quirky tidbit from some medieval records is the variety of mundane objects that ended up being the death weapon. While knives and swords were common, you also find cases involving hammers, axes, shovels, rocks, and even cooking implements. One record mentions a man killed with a frozen fish. It really emphasizes how impulsive and opportunistic these killings could be, using whatever was immediately available in the environment. It gives a grim chuckle, imagining a court case centered around a deadly cod. The frequency of murder in medieval cities, compared to modern ones, is an open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that medieval urban life was significantly more violent, and that murder rates were higher, citing the frequent appearance of homicide cases in surviving court records and the general acceptance of carrying weapons. Others contend that while the manner of violence might have been different, more stabbings and bludgeonings, fewer shootings, and recording methods varied wildly, overall rates might not have been drastically different when accounting for population sizes and life expectancy. It's hard to make direct comparisons across such different societies and record-keeping systems. But for the people living there, the threat, however statistically probable, was real, and the consequences for being involved in a killing, whether as victim or perpetrator, were absolute. The justice system, such as it was, would come down upon you with crushing weight, as we're about to see. So with all this crime and potential for sudden violence swirling around you, you might be wondering, okay, but where are the cops? Where's the law and order? Good question. The medieval city did have guardians figures tasked with keeping the peace, but they were a far cry from the professional police forces we know today. These were typically the city watch, sometimes called the watch and ward. You might spot them occasionally on your travels through the streets, particularly at night, or maybe you hear the shuffle of their feet and the low murmur of their voices as they pass by. Their appearance isn't exactly intimidating. They aren't uniformed in the modern sense. They might wear some kind of civic badge or armband, but primarily they look like, well, citizens. And that's because in many cities that's exactly what they were. A mainstream historical fact about medieval cities is that maintaining the night watch was often a civic duty, a responsibility rotated among the male householders of the city. You, if you were a resident, would have to take your turn serving a certain number of nights a year. Imagine finishing a long day's work as a baker or a weaver, then having to pull an overnight shift, wandering dark, dangerous alleys, armed with little more than a staff or a spear and a lantern. Doesn't sound like a job description for a superhero, does it? Some larger or wealthier cities did employ a small number of full-time watchmen or sergeants, maybe even a designated constable or bailiff in charge, but their numbers were always inadequate for the size and complexity of the urban environment. Their duties were basic patrol. The streets enforced the curfew after the ringing of the curfew bell, which literally means cover fire, a signal to bank your fires for the night arrest anyone found committing a crime in their presence and respond to the hue and cry raised by citizens. The effectiveness of this system, as you might guess, was limited. Citizen watchmen, being amateurs who'd rather be asleep in their beds, weren't exactly highly motivated or well-trained. They might stick to the main, better-lit streets, or even huddle together in a tavern for warmth and courage, leaving the darker, more dangerous corners of the city unchecked. Their equipment was often rudimentary. Confronting armed robbers or a group of drunken brawlers wasn't high on their list of desirable activities. Raising the alarm and hoping other citizens came out to help was often their primary tactic. And then there's the potential for corruption, which, let's be honest, existed in every corner of medieval society. A few coins slipped into the palm of a watchman could ensure he didn't see that minor infraction, or didn't question why you were out after curfew, or maybe even pointed you away from a certain area where some business was about to go down. For low-paid or unpaid watchmen, a bribe could be a significant temptation. It was easier to look the other way than risk injury or engage in a lengthy, complicated process of apprehending and processing a suspect. A quirky tidbit about the medieval watch is that their duties sometimes extended to rather specific or unusual tasks beyond just crime prevention. In some cities, they were responsible for checking that chimneys weren't fire hazards or ensuring sanitation rules, basic as they were being followed, or even collecting specific minor fines on the spot for things like public nuisance. Imagine a watchman fining someone for singing too loudly after dark while a robbery is happening down the street. Priorities. The limitations of the watch meant that you couldn't rely on them for protection in the way you might rely on modern emergency services. If you were being robbed or assaulted, your best hope was to shout as loud as possible and hope your neighbors were willing and able to come to your aid, raising that crucial hue and cry that formally obligated others to assist in pursuing a suspect. Without that immediate citizen response, the chances of a criminal being caught red-handed by the watch were relatively slim. This leads to an open scholarly debate about the overall effectiveness of the medieval watch system. Some argue it was a necessary, albeit imperfect, deterrent that maintained some semblance of order in a challenging environment. Others contend it was largely ineffective against serious crime and primarily served to enforce curfews and catch minor offenders, providing little real protection to the average citizen. Whatever the academic consensus, experiencing the medieval city firsthand, you quickly understand that personal safety is primarily your responsibility. The watch is there technically, but they are not your shield. So, you've managed to survive the cut purses, avoid the late-night robbers, and duck out of the way of a couple of messy brawls. But what happens if someone does get caught? Perhaps a cut purse is spotted in the act, and the victim immediately raises the hue and cry, that loud shout for help that in theory galvanizes everyone nearby to pursue the suspect. Or maybe the city watch for once is in the right place at the right time. When a criminal is apprehended, the initial steps toward medieval justice are swift and by modern standards rather rudimentary. Let's say you witnessed a theft and joined the chase. Or maybe you were the suspect caught red-handed with someone else's property. The moment you are physically restrained, whether by a determined citizen or a watchman, you are officially in custody. There's no Miranda rights here, no elaborate arrest procedure read from a card. You're simply seized and held. A mainstream historical fact about medieval justice is the importance of the hue and cry. If a crime was committed, the victim was legally obligated to raise the alarm, and all able-bodied citizens who heard it were in turn obligated to drop what they were doing and assist in the pursuit. Failure to do so could result in a fine. So in theory, the whole city was supposed to turn into an impromptu posse. Once you're caught, you're likely marched probably not gently to the nearest authority figure. This could be a constable, a bailiff, or even the mayor or a town councilor, if it's a significant case or a large city. This isn't an interrogation room. It's often just an impromptu meeting in a street, a government building, or the gatehouse of the city wall. The official will hear the accusation, maybe ask you a few brief questions, but don't expect a detailed interview or a search for mitigating circumstances at this stage. The focus is on the immediate evidence. Were you caught with stolen goods? Were you seen fleeing the scene? Do witnesses accuse you? Based on this initial, often cursory assessment, a decision is made. If the evidence seems strong and the crime serious enough, you are taken to a holding area. This isn't a purpose-built, clean police station cell block. Medieval jails, or jails pronounced like jails, were often temporary or repurposed spaces. A basement beneath the guild hall, a room in a castle tower, a fortified gatehouse, or sometimes a small dedicated building. And let me tell you, conditions were grim. Picture it, dark, damp, poorly ventilated. Sanitation is virtually non-existent. A bucket in the corner is your only facility. You might be sharing the space with a variety of other unfortunates, accused thieves, brawlers, debtors, maybe even someone arrested for violating curfew. There's no segregation by crime or perceived danger. You're all just in there. Food is minimal and likely poor quality, maybe stale bread and watery gruel. You might have to pay the jailer for better provisions or for basic comforts, like a blanket, assuming you had any money or could have someone bring it to you. Yes, you often had to pay for your own upkeep in jail, another charming medieval reality. If you were poor and had no one to help you, life in the holding cell could be a slow descent into misery, cold hunger, and sickness. The purpose of holding you here isn't punishment itself, though it certainly feels like it. It's simply to keep you secured until your case can be heard, which could be days, weeks, or even longer, depending on the city's court schedule. For less serious offenses, or if you were a known resident with good standing, you might be released into the custody of sureties. Basically, people who vouched for you and promised to pay a penalty if you failed to show up for your trial. This was the medieval equivalent of bail, but based on personal connections and reputation rather than financial assets, though sometimes a financial guarantee was also required. If you were a stranger in town or accused of a serious felony finding, sureties would be impossible, and you'd be staying put in that unpleasant cell. A quirky tidbit you might find in historical records are the rather elaborate rules some cities had for their jailers. They were often explicitly forbidden from torturing prisoners, though this rule was frequently ignored or circumvented, and sometimes even required to provide a certain minimal amount of bread and water daily. Though again, enforcement of these rules was patchy. It highlights the basic framework of intent, even if the reality was much harsher. The initial process of arrest and holding in medieval cities raises an open scholarly debate about fairness and due process. Some historians argue that the system, relying on community participation, hue and cry, and local officials, was surprisingly effective for its time and context, prioritizing swift action. Others contend that it was inherently biased against the poor and strangers, lacking protections against false accusations and subjecting individuals to harsh conditions before they were even found guilty. Was it a rough but necessary system, or a breeding ground for injustice? Your experience in that cold, damp cell, waiting for an uncertain fate, would likely lead you to a rather negative conclusion. So, you've spent some time in that charming 5-star accommodation we call the medieval holding cell waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for the city's justice system, such as it is, to get around to your case. And when it does, don't expect a courtroom drama worthy of a legal procedural show. Medieval justice in cities could be swift, local, and frankly often arbitrary, relying on methods that seem bizarre and terrifying to our modern sensibilities. Depending on the severity of the accusation and the specific customs of the city you're in, your fate might be determined by a few different methods. For less serious matters, like a minor brawl or a small debt dispute, you might be able to clear your name through compurgation, also known as wager of law. This involved taking a solemn oath before a judge or city officials, swearing you were innocent, and then producing a number of oath helpers or compurgators, typically 12 respected men from the community, who would swear that they believed your oath was true. It wasn't about them having witnessed the event. It was about their faith in your character and reputation. If you could find enough reputable people to back you up, you walked free. If not, you were considered guilty. It essentially put your reputation and the reputation of your oath helpers on the line. For more serious accusations, especially felonies like theft or murder, and particularly in earlier periods, you might face something straight out of a nightmare trial by ordeal. The logic behind ordeals was the belief that God would intervene directly to reveal the truth. If you were innocent, divine power would protect you or provide a clear sign. If you were guilty, well, things wouldn't go so well. One common ordeal was the ordeal of hot iron. You would carry a piece of red-hot iron a certain distance, usually 9 feet. Your hand would then be bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, you were innocent. If it was infected or looked bad, you were guilty. Simple right. Unless you consider the near certainty of severe burns regardless of your guilt or innocence. Another lovely option was the ordeal of cold water. You would be tied up and thrown into a body of water that had been blessed. If you sank, you were innocent, the pure water accepting you. If you floated, you were guilty, the water rejecting your impurity. Never mind that human buoyancy varies. This was seen as God's judgment. A mainstream historical fact is that the church actually prohibited clerical involvement in trial by ordeal in 1215, leading to a decline in its use. But these practices didn't vanish overnight, and the memory and underlying belief in divine judgment in trials persisted in various forms. As time went on, particularly in more sophisticated urban centers trial, before a judge or a panel of city officials became more common. These officials, often the mayor, alderman, or appointed justices, would hear testimony from accusers and witnesses. But this wasn't a modern trial. There were no lawyers in the way we know them, no cross-examination as a standard practice, and often little in the way of physical evidence presented scientifically. Decisions might be based heavily on the reputation of the accused, and the accuser, the number of witnesses, and the official's own judgment, which could be influenced by personal biases or political considerations. It was justice delivered by community leaders, not necessarily trained legal experts. You didn't have a right to remain silent without it being held against you, and your testimony could be taken under duress or even torture, though that was technically only supposed to be applied to extract confessions, not determine guilt, initially another rule often bent or broken. The process was designed to be relatively quick, clearing cases efficiently. It was less about establishing truth beyond a shadow of a doubt, and more about reaching a verdict and maintaining social order. A guilty verdict often led directly and rapidly to sentencing. A truly quirky tidbit is that some medieval trials involved animals as the accused. If an animal caused a death or significant damage, it could be formally tried, complete with legal representation. Yes, lawyers for animals. The punishment could be execution, often carried out in a public spectacle. Imagine a pig being formally hanged for killing a child. It sounds absurd now, but it reflects a different legal and theological worldview, where animals were sometimes held morally accountable. The reliance on methods like ordeal and the lack of formal legal protections for the accused lead to an open scholarly debate about the fundamental fairness of medieval urban justice. Some historians argue that while seemingly brutal or arbitrary, these systems reflected the values and beliefs of the time and were perhaps less capricious in practice than they appear, with community pressure and fear of divine judgment sometimes encouraging honesty. Others contend that they were ripe for manipulation by the powerful, stacked against the poor, and inherently unreliable, often condemning the innocent based on bad luck or personal animosity? Was it a justice system? Or just a system for deciding who got punished, standing there facing judgment from men who hold your life in their hands? You'd probably just hope for a clean wound or to sink quickly. So you've been through the ringer, accused, caught perhaps, even faced a judge or an ordeal, and you've been found guilty. The immediate outcome isn't always the dungeon or the executioner's block, not for many common offenses. Often, the first step in your punishment, after the fear of the trial, is public humiliation. Medieval justice understood the power of shame, the idea that stripping you of your dignity in front of the very community you wronged could be a powerful deterrent both for you and for anyone watching. And everyone would be watching. The city has designated spots for this spectacle, usually in the busiest square or near the market, places where the maximum number of people will see you. The most iconic devices for this are the stocks and the pillory. You might have seen them standing empty, just wooden contraptions looking somewhat benign. But when they're in use, they become instruments of discomfort and profound degradation. The stocks are simpler, heavy wooden planks with semicircles cut into them, hinged, so they can be closed around your ankles, sometimes also your wrists. You're forced to sit on a low bench, or sometimes on the ground with your legs locked forward. Your movement is severely restricted. You can't stand up. You can't easily defend yourself, and you're exposed to the elements, and more importantly, to the gaze of everyone who passes by. You might be left there for a few hours or an entire day depending on the sentence. It's uncomfortable, your limbs ache, and the vulnerability is intense. The pillory is similar, but perhaps even more humiliating. It's a wooden frame, usually on a raised platform, with holes for your head and wrists. You stand, or sometimes kneel precariously, with your head and hands locked in place. This position makes it impossible to hide your face and leaves you completely defenseless. You're literally held up for public inspection, a living example of what happens when you break the city's rules. A mainstream historical fact is that stocks and pillories were incredibly common features in towns and cities across medieval Europe, used for a wide range of offenses, highlighting the universal belief in the power of public shaming as a tool of justice. What kinds of crimes landed you in the stocks or pillory? Petty theft was a big one, especially if it was your first offense. Cheating merchants, like using false weights or selling shoddy goods, were prime candidates. Public drunkenness, disturbing the peace, spreading gossip, or slander vagrancy. Any behavior that disrupted the social order or violated public trust could earn you a stint in these devices. It was punishment for being a nuisance, a cheat, or a minor criminal in the eyes of the community, and the community was encouraged to participate in your punishment. This is where it gets truly unpleasant. As you sit or stand there exposed and helpless, people walk by. They stare. They laugh. They yell insults. They might even throw things. Now, depictions sometimes show showers of rotten fruit and vegetables, which certainly happened. But it could also escalate. Mud, animal dung, even stones could be thrown, causing not just further humiliation, but actual injury. The watch might be nearby, but their intervention to protect you from the public was inconsistent, to say the least. You are, for that time, fair game for the crowd's derision and anger. Imagine the feeling, trapped, unable to move your face, exposed, enduring hours of verbal abuse and potential physical assault. The shame is overwhelming, etching itself into your memory. This public spectacle was meant to serve a dual purpose. It punished the offender by making them an object of scorn, and it served as a stark warning to everyone else about the consequences of misbehavior. It was theater, albeit cruel theater, reinforcing the city's moral boundaries. A quirky tidbit is that for specific crimes, offenders in the pillory might have objects related to their offense hung around their neck or attached to the pillory. A baker selling underweight bread might have the offending loaf hung around their neck. A cheating merchant might have their false weights displayed. Someone caught spreading gossip might have a heavy wooden gossip's bridle placed on their head, sometimes with a metal bit forced into their mouth. It was a very literal form of justice, making the crime visible on the body of the punished. The effectiveness of public shaming as a deterrent is an open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the intense social stigma and physical discomfort were indeed powerful tools that discouraged repeat offenses and reinforced communal values. Others contend that it could have the opposite effect, hardening the offender, making them an outcast with nothing left to lose, and potentially driving them deeper into the criminal underworld rather than back towards respectable society. Was it a necessary public spectacle, or did it just create more desperate outcasts? You might have a strong opinion on that after a few hours stuck in the pillory with a bag of moldy turnips being aimed at your head. If public shaming in the stocks or pillory was the city's way of saying, "We know what you did and we're very disappointed," then the next tier of punishment involved a far more direct and lasting message, one delivered through physical pain and permanent marking. These were punishments designed not just to inflict discomfort, but to leave an undeniable, often debilitating sign of your crime on your very body. They were reserved for more serious offenses, or for repeat offenders who hadn't learned their lesson after a session in the stocks. One common physical punishment was whipping. You might be stripped to the waist and tied to a post, or dragged through the streets behind a cart receiving lashes in public view. The whip could be made of knotted cords or leather thongs, and the number of lashes varied depending on the crime and the city. It was intensely painful, causing severe welts and bleeding, and leaving behind permanent scars. It was a step up in severity from the stocks, a visceral demonstration of the law's power and the community's disapproval enacted directly onto your flesh. While not necessarily permanently disabling, unless done with extreme brutality, the scars were a visible mark, a reminder to you and everyone else of your past transgression. More severe still were punishments that involved branding or mutilation. Branding used a hot iron shaped into a letter or symbol to burn a mark onto the offender's skin, often on a visible part of the body, like the forehead or cheek, or sometimes the hand. A mainstream historical fact is that branding was frequently used to mark repeat offenders, particularly thieves. A common brand was the letter T for thief, or sometimes symbols specific to the city. This mark was indelible. There was no hiding it. It served as a permanent scarlet letter, or rather a charred, painful brand, instantly identifying you as a convicted criminal to anyone who saw you. Imagine applying for an honest job with a large T seared onto your forehead. It significantly limited your options and marked you as someone to be wary of for the rest of your life. Mutilation was the most brutal form of physical punishment short of execution. This involved the cutting off of body parts, often the part believed to be used in the commission of the crime. A thief might have their hand cut off. Someone who committed perjury or slander might have their tongue pierced or cut out. Forgers might lose their hand. There are even records of noses or ears being cropped or cut off. This was a punishment designed not only to inflict agonizing pain and public horror, but also to permanently disable the offender from committing that specific crime, again hard to steal without a hand, and to serve as a terrifying physical example to others. Seeing someone with a bandaged stump where a hand should be, or with scarred absent ears, was a viscerally shocking reminder of the consequences of crime. These punishments were often carried out publicly, sometimes immediately after sentencing, in the same busy squares used for the stocks. The executioner, or a designated city official, would perform the act. There was little concern for hygiene or pain relief beyond a potential swig of ale. Infection was a significant risk afterwards, and many people likely died from the consequences of their punishment rather than the act itself. It highlights the stark, brutal nature of medieval justice. The punishment wasn't just the immediate pain. It was the long-term suffering, disability, and social ostracization that followed. A quirky tidbit from some legal records mentions specific, almost ceremonial methods of mutilation. For example, a baker caught selling underweight bread might have his ear nailed to his own bakery door, forced to rip it free to escape, though this could be argued as a form of extreme shaming bordering on mutilation. Or the precise number of lashes for whipping could be codified in painstaking detail based on the value of the goods stolen, creating a strange mathematical cruelty. The use of such brutal physical punishments raises an open scholarly debate about their effectiveness as a deterrent versus their role in simply creating a permanently marked and desperate underclass. Some historians argue that the fear of these mutilating punishments being so visible and debilitating was a powerful force in discouraging serious crime. Others contend that they often stripped individuals of their ability to earn an honest living, pushed them to the absolute margins of society, and may have actually contributed to a cycle of crime by leaving them with few options other than further illegal activity. Did cutting off a thief's hand stop theft, or just create a one-handed beggar who still needed to survive? It's a difficult question to answer definitively from centuries later. But one thing is certain: endure whipping, branding, or mutilation, and your time in the city's underworld is marked on you physically and irrevocably. For some crimes, or for those deemed incorrigible repeat offenders, the medieval city's justice system had one final ultimate answer. Beyond the shaming, beyond the pain and the marking, lay execution. The death penalty was reserved for the most serious affronts to God the King or the fragile social order of the city. It was the ultimate expression of state power and the community's collective horror at certain acts. And like the physical punishments we just discussed, it was almost always carried out in public for all to see. You would hear about it in advance. A public crier might announce the date, time, and location of the execution, often listing the names of the condemned and their crimes. These events weren't hidden away. They were spectacles, grim theater designed to entertain, to edify, and above all, to terrify. On the appointed day, large crowds would gather at the execution site, which might be a permanent gallows just outside the city gate, a scaffold erected in the main square, or another prominent location. People would climb onto rooftops, jostle for position, and bring their lunches. It was a public holiday of the grimmest sort. The most common method of execution for ordinary criminals convicted of felonies like murder, grand larceny, theft of valuable goods, or sometimes arson, was hanging. The condemned would be led in a procession through the streets to the gallows, often accompanied by priests offering last rites. The gallows themselves were simple wooden structures, sometimes just two uprights and a crosspiece. The drop wasn't always sufficient for a quick death, and strangulation was a common outcome prolonging the agony. A mainstream historical fact is that permanent gallows were erected outside many city gates as a constant visible warning to anyone entering or leaving. For crimes deemed particularly heinous or against divine law, like heresy, dissenting from official church doctrine, treason, betrayal of the king or state, or certain sexual offenses considered unnatural, burning at the stake was sometimes the chosen method. This was seen as a way to purify the soul through fire, and was a terrifying spectacle intended to emphasize the severity of the transgression in the eyes of God and man. Beheading, usually by sword or axe, was another method often considered a more honorable death, and sometimes reserved for nobles or for specific high crimes, like treason committed by men. Women convicted of treason were often burned. It required a skilled executioner for a quick, clean strike, and the risk of a botched job added another layer of horror to the proceedings. Regardless of the method, the execution was a carefully managed piece of public performance. The condemned might be given a chance to make a last speech, confess their sins, and warn others against following their path. This confession was crucial, as it legitimized the state's actions in the eyes of the crowd and offered the condemned a final chance at spiritual redemption. The crowd's reaction could vary. Some might offer prayers, others might jeer and throw things depending on the nature of the crime and the popularity or unpopularity of the condemned. After the execution, the body's fate varied. Sometimes, particularly for major criminals or those executed for treason, the body might be left hanging on the gallows as a long-term warning, rotting as a gruesome deterrent. This was known as gibbeting. More commonly, the body was cut down and quickly buried, often in unconsecrated ground outside the city walls, denying the criminal a Christian burial and adding a layer of posthumous punishment. A quirky tidbit from the annals of medieval justice includes bizarre posthumous punishments or rituals associated with executions. In some places, the severed head of a traitor might be displayed on a pike on the city gates. There are even accounts of criminals being executed in effigy if they manage to escape burning a dummy, representing them as a symbolic act of justice and warning. Or rituals where the executioner received specific, sometimes odd perquisites from the condemned or the city after the job was done. The effectiveness of public executions as a deterrent to crime is predictably an open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the sheer terror and public nature of these events must have instilled fear and significantly discouraged potential criminals, reinforcing the power of the state and the consequences of breaking its laws. Others contend that while shocking, they may have had little long-term effect on crime rates, that many in the crowds were already hardened to violence, and that such spectacles might even normalize brutality or inspire defiance in some cases. Did seeing someone hang stop you from stealing, or just make you try harder not to get caught? It's a question without an easy answer, lost in the silent reactions of centuries-gone crowds. But as you stand near the edge of the square, feeling the shift in the air as the time approaches, the reality is stark. For some, the story of their time in the city's underworld ends here, on the scaffold for all to witness. Leaving behind the public squares and the grim finality of the gallows, let's descend into a different part of the city's underworld. Not one of crime and punishment, but one of necessary yet utterly reviled labor. While most people in the city had recognizable trades, bakers, smiths, weavers, merchants, there were other jobs vital for the city's functioning that were performed by people living on the extreme margins of society. Occupations considered so foul, so distasteful, that they were seen as inherently polluting. And perhaps the most infamous of these was the gong farmer. Yes, the gong farmer. Not exactly a career path aspirational parents told their children about. What did a gong farmer do? Their job was simple, essential, and stomach-churningly unpleasant. They emptied the city's cesspits and privies. Medieval homes and buildings didn't have plumbing as we know it. Waste collected in cesspits dug beneath or near the building, or flowed into ditches and eventually the rivers. When these pits filled up, and in a crowded city they filled up regularly, someone had to dig out the contents and haul it away. That someone was the gong farmer. Imagine the scene under the cover of darkness. Because this job was considered too offensive for daylight hours, the gong farmer arrives at a property. Armed with shovels, buckets and carts or boats, if the city had waterways, they would open the cesspit cover and descend into centuries of accumulated human waste. The smell alone, even by medieval standards, must have been unimaginable. We're talking about methane gas, the decomposition of organic matter, a concentrated assault on the nostrils that likely clung to their clothes and skin long after the job was done. Their work was physically demanding and incredibly dangerous. Falling into a deep cesspit could mean drowning in filth or being overcome by toxic fumes. Diseases bred in these unsanitary conditions were a constant threat. Yet the job was absolutely vital. Without the gong farmers clearing the pits, waste would overflow into streets and cellars, creating even worse health hazards and making large parts of the city uninhabitable. They were, in a very literal sense, cleaning up the city's mess, performing a service that allowed everyone else to live slightly less miserably. Despite their essential role, gong farmers were at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. They were considered ritually and physically unclean. People avoided contact with them, likely crossing the street to give them a wide berth. There were often specific regulations governing their work and lives. A mainstream historical fact is that in many medieval cities, gong farmers were legally required to work only at night and were sometimes forced to live outside the city walls or in designated segregated areas, literally putting them on the fringe of the urban community. Their profession wasn't just low status, it was polluting, marking them as perpetual outsiders. It's hard to even crack a light joke about a job this grim, but there's a strange sort of dark humor in the very names given to these workers in different places and times. Night soil men, muck rakers, though that term also applied to general street cleaners, or my favorite, perhaps the rather euphemistic rakers or scavengers that appear in some records as if just picking up surface garbage was their only task. A quirky tidbit is that despite the low status, the job could sometimes be passed down through families, creating generations of workers tied to this necessary grim labor. In some places, it was even regulated by the city council, granting specific individuals or families the sole right to perform the work, perhaps offering a tiny shred of official recognition but not much in the way of social standing. The extreme low status and social exclusion of gong farmers and similar laborers raises an open scholarly debate. Was their position solely a result of the repulsive nature of their work? Or did it also reflect pre-existing social prejudices against manual laborers? The poor or specific groups who were pushed into these undesirable roles, was the revulsion purely practical? Or was it a way for the rest of society to reinforce their own cleanliness and social standing by designating others as inherently unclean? It's hard to fully untangle the threads of practical necessity health fears and social prejudice. But standing in the dark, near a building with a full cesspit, you might catch a faint, truly awful whiff, and understand viscerally just how tough, how isolated, and how utterly thankless the gong farmer's life truly was. They were the hidden gears in the city's machinery, dealing with the output nobody else wanted to acknowledge. Beyond the deeply unpleasant but undeniably critical work of the gong farmer, the medieval city's hidden machinery relied on several other professions that dealt with the literal mess of urban life. These weren't the glamorous jobs or even the respected skilled trades. These were jobs steeped in grime decay and things most citizens preferred to pretend didn't exist. But without them, the city would quickly become uninhabitable, overrun by pest disease and the sheer volume of its own organic refuse. Meet the rat catcher. In a place crammed with people, animals, food stores, and waste rats weren't just a nuisance. They were a plague. They gnawed through food supplies, damaged property, and most dangerously, carried fleas that transmitted diseases, including the dreaded bubonic plague when it swept through Europe. The rat catcher was in a constant thankless battle against these ubiquitous rodents. Their methods were rudimentary setting traps, using crude poisons, risky for people and other animals too, and sometimes employing trained terriers or ferrets to hunt the rats down. It was a job that involved navigating dark cellars, sewers, and garbage heaps, constantly exposed to filth and the risk of bites. A mainstream historical fact is that cities often paid bounties for rats, sometimes requiring proof of the kill-like tales indicating the scale of the problem and the public recognition of the rat catcher's necessary, if unpleasant, service. Then there was the knacker, sometimes called a render or flayer. Their job was to dispose of dead animals, livestock that died of disease or old age, stray dogs, and cats' horses that collapsed in the street. In a time before widespread refrigeration and sanitary disposal practices, a dead animal quickly became a putrefying biohazard. The knacker would haul the carcass away, often to a designated area outside the city walls, where they would process it. This could involve skinning the animal for hides, boiling down fat for tallow, used for candles and soap, or rendering bones for glue. It was a smelly, gruesome job, working with decaying flesh, often surrounded by scavengers. Despite turning a necessary disposal into potentially useful products, the knacker was also viewed with suspicion and distaste, dealing as they did with death and decay. And let's not forget the humble or not so humble sewer or ditch cleaner. While dedicated sewers, as we might imagine them, were rare in medieval cities, many streets had open channels or ditches designed to carry away rainwater and whatever other liquids were dumped into them, which was a lot. These quickly became clogged with mud garbage and waste. The ditch cleaner's job involved wading into these foul-smelling stagnant channels, shoveling out the accumulated filth, and trying to keep the flow going. It was a messy, physically demanding job, working ankle-deep or worse in sludge, constantly exposed to whatever pathogens lurked within. These professions, rat catchers, knackers, ditch cleaners, shared a common bond. They dealt with the unwanted outputs of city life. They worked in conditions that would make most people gag, handling decay disease and dirt on a daily basis. Like the gong farmer, their social status was low, often placing them in that underworld of necessary but marginalized laborers. They were indispensable for the city's rudimentary hygiene and public health, yet they were often segregated, avoided, and looked down upon. Their lives were likely harsh, involving long hours, dangerous conditions, and little social recognition or comfort. A quirky tidbit about knackers is that they were often the ones responsible for disposing of the bodies of executed criminals who weren't left on the gallows. This further associated them with death and things the respectable public wanted removed from sight, cementing their place on the social fringes. Another strange detail from some cities is the existence of very specific, almost comical contracts for rat catchers detailing the price per rat or the required proof of kill, showing a bureaucratic attempt to manage a very messy, visceral problem. The collective contribution of these grime jobs to the medieval urban environment is an open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that despite their low status, these workers performed vital public health functions that were crucial, if inadequate, for preventing even worse conditions and disease outbreaks in densely populated cities. Others contend that while necessary, their work was only a band-aid solution to fundamental problems of sanitation and hygiene that medieval cities were ill-equipped to handle, and their marginalization highlights the era's stark social inequalities. Did they make a significant difference to urban health, or were they simply cleaning up the inevitable mess of a pre-industrial city? Regardless, they were the unseen, underappreciated workforce, the grime fighters living and working in the literal and metaphorical dirt of the medieval city. Moving away from the grim necessities of waste disposal and dealing with dead things, let's look at a more colorful, yet still marginalized group who inhabited the medieval city streets, the performers and storytellers. These were the entertainers, the people who brought a splash of diversion and spectacle to the often gritty reality of urban life. You'd find them in the market squares, outside tavern doors, or anywhere a crowd might gather, trying to earn a few coins with their talents. Who were these performers? There was the minstrel, or jongleur, perhaps playing a lute or harp and singing ballads, tales of knights and ladies, historical events, or even scandalous gossip set to music. There might be acrobats tumbling and performing feats of balance, or jugglers tossing balls, knives, or whatever else they could keep in the air. You might encounter someone with a trained animal, maybe a dancing bear, poor thing, or a monkey performing tricks. And then there were the storytellers, weaving tales of faraway lands, epic battles, or humorous fables captivating audiences in a time when books were rare and literacy was low for most people. Their livelihood was precarious. They didn't have fixed shops or workshops like artisans. They made their living from the generosity of their audience, passing around a hat or a bowl after their performance, hoping for pennies, farthings, or perhaps a piece of bread or a drink. Sometimes they might find temporary patronage from a wealthy merchant or a local lord for a special event. But for most, it was a hand-to-mouth existence, constantly needing to attract a crowd and convince them to part with their meager coins. These performers played a significant role in the city's cultural life. In an era without mass media, they were sources of entertainment news and cultural transmission. They spread stories, songs, and ideas from one town to the next, keeping alive oral traditions and sharing information and misinformation across distances. A mainstream historical fact is that minstrels and jongleurs were key figures in spreading popular culture and vernacular literature throughout medieval society, acting as a kind of mobile information and entertainment network. Despite their popularity and the joy they could bring, these itinerant entertainers were often viewed with suspicion by the authorities and the more settled citizens. Their very nature was disruptive to the medieval social order. They weren't tied to the land like peasants or bound by the rules of a guild like craftsmen. They moved freely from place to place, making them difficult to tax control or monitor. Their lack of a fixed abode or master meant they didn't fit neatly into the established feudal or urban hierarchy. Furthermore, their association with crowds and public places, sometimes late at night outside taverns, linked them in the minds of some to less reputable elements. Gamblers, prostitutes, petty criminals. While many were simply trying to earn an honest living with their skills, the itinerant lifestyle and the company they kept meant they were often lumped in with vagrants and undesirables. Laws in some cities treated them with suspicion, sometimes restricting where they could perform or requiring them to register with authorities. A quirky tidbit is that some regulations specifically tried to distinguish between respectable minstrels, often those with noble patronage, and lower-class jongleurs, or street performers, attempting to stratify even this marginalized group. Some cities even had bizarre specific rules like forbidding certain types of instruments or performances deemed too rowdy or immoral. Were these performers truly part of the criminal underworld? Generally no, not in the sense of being thieves or murderers, but their place on the margins of society. Their itinerancy and the suspicion they faced meant they lived a precarious existence, often forced into areas where the line between respectable and less respectable behavior blurred. They were part of the vibrant, messy tapestry of the medieval city, providing much-needed distraction and culture, but always with one foot outside the door, ready to move on to the next town, the next square, the next potential audience. This leads to an open scholarly debate about the true social status of medieval performers. Some historians argue that despite legal restrictions and official suspicion, they were deeply integrated into popular culture and essential for community life, their marginality overstated by elites who disliked their independence. Others contend that the legal restrictions, social stigma, and economic precarity meant they were indeed living on the very fringes, often struggling for survival, and lacking the protections afforded to more settled citizens. Were they celebrated artists or tolerated vagrants? Perhaps it depended entirely on the quality of their performance and the mood of the crowd on any given day. Beyond the acrobats and ballad singers who might momentarily entertain the crowds, the medieval city also contained individuals pushed to the absolute fringes of society groups who survived day to day on the edge of starvation and social acceptance. These weren't just people down on their luck. These were the truly marginalized, often physically set apart from the rest of the population, forming the deepest layer of the urban underworld. You would see them everywhere yet nowhere, present in plain sight, but often ignored or feared the beggars, ranging from the genuinely infirm or elderly who couldn't work to the able-bodied poor who had lost their land or trade to outright vagrants who preferred a life of wandering beggars were a constant presence in the city street squares and outside church doors. They would hold out their hands, display their deformities or ailments, and ask for alms. Christian charity dictated that giving to the poor was a virtue, and many citizens did offer food or coins. However, there was also deep suspicion towards sturdy beggars, those perceived as healthy enough to work, but choosing not to seen as idle and potentially criminal. Cities tried various ways to regulate begging, sometimes issuing licenses to those deemed deserving or attempting to drive others out. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society held complex and often contradictory attitudes towards poverty and begging, oscillating between religious calls for charity and secular anxieties about social disorder and idleness. Even more starkly segregated were those afflicted with diseases that inspired fear and revulsion, most notably leprosy. Based on the medieval understanding of the disease, which may have encompassed various skin conditions, not just what we call leprosy, today's sufferers were considered ritually impure and contagiously dangerous. They were legally and socially compelled to live apart from the healthy population. This meant living in leper hospitals known as lazarets, which were almost always located outside the city walls. If allowed into the city briefly, they often had to carry a bell or a clapper to announce their presence and warn others to keep their distance. Their existence was one of profound isolation and reliance on charity, their physical condition making them the most visible and feared outcasts. Other groups could find themselves pushed to the margins too. Those excommunicated by the church were cut off from the spiritual community, and often the social one as well, losing legal protections and support. People banished from the city for crimes were forced to live outside the walls, surviving as best they could. Individuals with severe mental illness or disabilities that prevented them from working or fitting into societal norms could also find themselves without a safety net reliant on family, if they had any willing or able to care for them, or charity, often ending up begging on the streets. These were the people who lived day to day, outside the formal structures of the city. They weren't part of guilds, didn't own property, often didn't have stable family support within the urban community. Their survival depended on the fluctuating kindness of strangers, the sparse resources of charitable institutions, which were often overwhelmed or resorting to desperate measures. For some, this desperation could push them into the petty crime we discussed earlier: stealing food, begging aggressively, or engaging in low-level hustles to survive. They were the city's conscience and its shame, a constant reminder of the brutal precariousness of life outside the established order. A quirky tidbit about lepers is the specific religious and legal rituals that sometimes accompanied their segregation. They might undergo a ceremony akin to a funeral, symbolically dying to the world, before being sent to the lazaret, emphasizing their complete separation from their former lives. Another strange historical detail involves specific regulations on begging territories within cities, with certain spots outside churches or gates informally or formally claimed by different groups of beggars, leading to their own form of micro-territoriality. The distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving sturdy beggars in medieval thought is an open scholarly debate. Some historians argue this was a genuine attempt to differentiate between those who couldn't work and those who wouldn't, reflecting a practical concern about social order and resource allocation. Others contend that this distinction was often used to criminalize poverty, justifying harsh treatment of those who simply lacked opportunities or were displaced, labeling them as idle threats to be controlled rather than citizens needing support. Similarly, the actual prevalence of leprosy and other stigmatized diseases and the effectiveness and humanity of the segregation practices remain subjects of ongoing historical discussion. Regardless of the academic arguments, seeing the gaunt faces, the tattered clothes, and the signs of disease or disability, you understand that for these individuals, the medieval city was not a place of opportunity, but a harsh, often unforgiving environment where survival itself was a daily desperate struggle lived out on the margins of sight and conscience. Now let the sounds of the city fade, the cries of vendors, the clang of the blacksmith, the distant mournful bell. Let them all drift away. You've walked through the crowded streets, glimpsed the shadows where crime lurked, felt the chill of medieval justice, and seen the hidden lives of those who performed the city's dirtiest jobs and those who lived on its outermost edges. It was a world vibrant and dangerous, a complex tapestry woven with threads of commerce, faith, and the constant quiet struggle for survival outside the established norms. Take a deep, slow breath. The smells are gone. The noise is fading. Your room is quiet, safe bathed in soft light or comfortable darkness. There are no cut purses here, no damp cells, no judgmental crowds. Just the gentle hum of the fan, perhaps, and the feeling of soft pillows. Let the images soften the historical reality recede like the tide. You're back safe in your own time and space. There's nothing to fear here tonight, just peace, calm, and the quiet invitation to sleep. Let yourself relax completely. Every muscle, every thought. Just ease into it. Sweet dreams.